Metal screams as it tears apart somewhere in the dark. Boots pound into wet mud, slipping, scrambling as a radio spits out broken words before collapsing into static. Panicked breaths cut through the smoke while distant artillery rolls like thunder beyond the hills. Searchlights snap on, slicing the night as bullets spark off steel and stone. In the chaos, a lone woman runs, coat torn, hands shaking, eyes fixed forward, dodging shadows that shouldn't be moving this fast. Soldiers shout orders she doesn't understand, alarms begin to rise, and the ground trembles beneath her feet. She looks like a civilian caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But no one knows the girl slipping through the darkness is about to change everything. And then, something impossible happened. Asterisk, it is late 1944, deep inside occupied Europe, where enemy-controlled rail hubs, fuel depots, and encrypted relay stations quietly decide the fate of entire armies. Allied commanders study maps layered with arrows and pins, knowing that if the next operation fails, entire cities could burn and thousands of civilians would never see morning. German codes have gone silent, resistance cells have vanished, and supply convoys are being destroyed without warning. The woman moving through the chaos isn't listed as a soldier officially. She doesn't exist, but she carries knowledge no reconnaissance plane could gather. If her mission fails, fleets will sail into traps, airfields will be bombed blind, and the war will tilt decisively. As commanders wait for her signal, staring at diagrams and intercepted fragments, no one realizes the real threat hasn't even appeared yet. Asterisk, 3 minutes after midnight. The first crack appears in what everyone believed was a controlled operation. Inside Allied command, a junior signals officer freezes as a decoded message resolves itself on the screen. Its characters misaligned, its authentication code incomplete. At first glance, it looks like corruption's static damage, a tired machine, a bad intercept, but then the coordinates register and a low murmur ripples through the room. They don't correspond to any known German unit, depot, or command post. Worse, the time stamp is wrong. It places the transmission in a window that shouldn't exist. Someone quietly says, "This wasn't supposed to happen." And in that instant, the mission shifts from risky to unstable. Almost simultaneously, radar operators report a sudden spike at the edge of the sector. Not scattered, not drifting. A clean, deliberate signal bloom that appears and holds for just long enough to be unmistakable before vanishing again. The room tightens. This changes everything. Spike like that isn't an accident, it's an announcement. Analysts scramble, layering maps and flight paths, trying to explain how something could appear where nothing should be operating. As they work, a second. Message breaks through the static, shorter than the first, stripped of padding, almost surgical in its precision. Buried in its structure is a reference point only a handful of Allied planners even know exists. Then someone sees it. A line in the decoded text doesn't refer to a unit or a location. It refers to a person, her. The realization hits like a physical blow. Chairs scrape back. Senior officer leans in closer, reading it again, hoping absurdly that it will change. Doesn't. The enemy isn't guessing. They're not reacting blindly. They know a woman is inside their perimeter, and they know enough about her role to signal it. The question crashes into the room all at once. Who sent the message, and how could they possibly know she was there? On the ground, the answer doesn't matter yet. Only the consequence does. Okay? An enemy flare shrieks into the sky, exploding into blinding white light that turns night into day. Shadows snap into sharp relief. Patrols stop wandering and start moving with purpose, their routes tightening, their spacing deliberate. She feels the change instantly, a pressure in the air, the sudden certainty that the darkness has become hostile. She presses herself into cover as boots redirect, radios chatter in clipped, controlled bursts. Engines begin to idle where silence was expected. Back at command, voices overlap as theories collide compromised resistance networks. A traitor signal. A leak buried somewhere no one wants to look. Each explanation is worse than the last. The radar spike appears again, closer this time, then disappears. A map is rotated, overlaid with a restricted projection rarely used. And suddenly the impossible coordinates make a terrible kind of sense. This isn't random movement, it's positioning. Whatever the enemy is doing, it's already in motion. On the ground, she doesn't run. Not yet. Running now would confirm everything. She stays still as light washes over her hiding place, and moves on, close enough that she can hear a guard's breath, smell oil and cold metal. Somewhere nearby, a radio barks an order she doesn't need to understand to recognize. The search isn't spreading outward, it's folding inward. Inside Allied headquarters, clock starts counting down, not officially, not aloud, but in every mind in the room. Because if the enemy knows she's there, then the window for extraction is collapsing by the second. Someone finally says what no one wants to hear if she doesn't break contact immediately. This mission won't end with intelligence. It will end with a containment operation. As patrols converge and command watches helplessly, the truth settles in with brutal clarity. This is no longer about what she can find. It's about whether she can survive long enough to get out. And the next 90 seconds will determine whether anyone survives. The night had already begun to unravel before she even realized it. What had been a careful infiltration, the sort of mission planned down to the second, memorized in detail, rehearsed in the shadows, was dissolving into unpredictability. Above the tree line, the moon was a pale smear behind clouds that scudded fast, carried by a wind that rattled bare branches. She moved through the mud, low to the ground, feeling the weight of her own presence pressing against every sound she made. The documents were inside her satchel, damp and heavy, clinging to her body like a second skin. Every step brought the distant echoes of artillery closer. The earth itself seemed to pulse with each report. Somewhere, a shell ripped the ground apart, sending mud and splinters into the air. Her heart hammered in time with the thud, and she swallowed hard, counting breaths like a mantra, trying to convince herself that she could stay invisible, but the enemy was not sleeping. Not tonight, not ever. Flares had erupted seconds ago, lighting up the compound she had studied for weeks. She had memorized the placement of every guard tower, every patrol route, every shadow in which she could hide. And now those shadows were no longer predictable. Soldiers shifted with deliberate patterns, converging toward areas she had never considered dangerous. She pressed herself against the side of a storage shed, mud seeping into her gloves, and listened. Boots approached, stopping short of her hiding place. The crunch of gravel, the metallic snap of a weapon, the hiss of breath, it was all too precise. Someone knew she was here. Meanwhile, back at Allied headquarters, analysts were struggling to reconcile fragments of intercepted communications with real-time radar data. The decoded message she had triggered had been only the first signal. Now multiple anomalies appeared in sequence, and it was impossible to tell which were intentional, which were coincidental, and which indicated a broader enemy maneuver. Officers argued over maps littered with pins and colored strings. A senior intelligence officer slammed a fist onto the table as he realized that entire troop movements were shifting to areas that had previously been considered quiet. "They're not just reacting," he said grimly. "They're orchestrating." Okay. On the ground, she barely moved, yet everything around her shifted with kinetic energy. A vehicle's headlights roared past, cutting a path across the forest floor. She flattened herself into the mud, feeling the cold seep into her bones, and pressed her fingers around the damp strap of the satchel. Her breathing slowed, measured, almost ritualized, because panic here would be fatal. Mind raced through contingency plans she had never wanted to use, assessing routes, considering cover, calculating timing down to milliseconds. Every second was a risk. Every misstep could be her last. And then the first real complication arrived. A wire she had bypassed in preparation is simple. Delicate tripwire attached to a secondary alarm snapped with a sharp ping she could feel in her chest. Instantly, movement erupted. Guards shouted, boots pounded toward the trigger point, and floodlights snapped on, sweeping the ground she had just left seconds before. She rolled, letting the light pass over her, timing her position to the shadows of nearby crates. Every sense screamed that she had been detected, but she had not been, not yet. Luck, skill, and timing had merged to keep her presence invisible for now. The chaos intensified in layers. Physical chaos first, boots on mud, rifles slamming against shoulders, shouted commands. The sudden roar of engines, dogs barking in the distance, and the unnatural smell of cordite hanging in the air. Strategic chaos layered onto Preda anomalies flashing in unexpected sectors. Intercepted signals contradicting the original mission plan. And command directives that arrived too late or conflicted with each other. Analysts at headquarters tried to make sense of the chaos, overlaying maps with intel fragments, comparing them to reconnaissance photos, triangulating positions, but the picture refused to settle. Every solution seemed to open 5 new questions. And every second wasted in indecision made the night more dangerous for her. She moved again, slow and deliberate, across the muddy expanse. A vehicle engine idled nearby, stopping her path, forcing her to take a longer, more treacherous route between 2 stacks of crates. Her gloves were slick with mud. The strap of her satchel pressed against her shoulder painfully. She counted steps, matched timing, memorized engine noise, listened for footsteps. Somewhere behind her, a radio crackled, dead words barely audible. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Moving prematurely would have been catastrophic. She advanced a few feet, then froze, feeling the air itself shift as if the enemy's awareness were a tangible pressure pushing down around her. Microsecond decisions now held the weight of life or death. Back in the command room, tension was palpable. An officer noticed that the coordinates from the first message matched a previously classified overlay a hidden sector used for experimental enemy deployments. The thought spread quickly. If the enemy had incorporated her presence into operational planning, the mission's risk had multiplied exponentially. Something bigger is coming, someone muttered, realizing the scale of what might be unfolding. Orders flew from officer to officer, some delayed, some contradictory, each mistake magnifying the uncertainty. On the ground, she had no idea what orders were circulating, only that the enemy's movements were now unnervingly precise, reacting as though she were a chess piece pushed into place by unseen hands. A new complication arose. The terrain shifted under her. Rain mixing with mud, slippery roots threatening every step. She slipped once, catching herself barely, her hands scraping raw against debris. She cursed under her breath, forcing herself to calm down. Adrenaline surged. Fear sharpened every sense. Every sound, every light, every shadow became a signal to be read with obsessive precision. She had no choice but to advance. Retreat was a risk equal to or greater than proceeding. Flares erupted again bright, cutting arcs of white over the forest and compound. She froze in a shallow ditch, heart hammering. Soldiers passed by, scanning, coordinated, their voices clipped. Her shadow, cast by the flickering flare, danced across the ground, a phantom movement she had to avoid exposing. She pressed herself against the earth, the mud soaking through her clothing, the cold biting at her bones, and reminded herself that the documents inside her bag represented far more than her life. They were the difference between success and catastrophic failure. She could not fail. She would not fail. In the command room, officers realized something that made blood run cold. The enemy's positioning and timing indicated they were expecting her, but not merely to capture her. Every movement suggested they were using her presence as a trigger. It was no longer an infiltration. It was a gauntlet. Every patrol, every light sweep, every engine that roared in the darkness was part of a calculated sequence, waiting for her to make the next move. If she stepped wrong, the enemy's plan would advance, regardless of whether she escaped. And this was only the beginning. She moved again, now with purpose sharpened by imminent danger. Every step was calculated, every breath measured. Floodlights scanned nearby areas, narrowly missing her by inches. She flattened herself against a supply crate, feeling the vibrations of distant artillery, the pounding of boots, the vibration of engines. Each element layered itself into the sensory chaos, demanding instant interpretation. One wrong move, one misjudged step, one faltering second could expose her and all she carried. Yet for all the immediate danger, she retained clarity. She had trained for this. She knew the risks. She understood the enemy's psychology and could anticipate their next moves by reading patterns. Listening to cadence, timing the sweep of lights and noting the small inconsistencies in patrol behavior. Each step forward was deliberate, precise, and terrifying in its consequence. Outside, the forest seemed alive, watching, testing her. Inside, Command monitored a digital map that was increasingly meaningless as enemy actions outpaced expectation. The situation teetered on the knife's edge. The line between success and disaster had narrowed to a fraction of a second. And she was walking along it. The forest seemed to close in around her. Rain drummed on leaves, turning the mud beneath her knees into a treacherous mix of liquid and earth that clung to boots, clothes and satchel alike. Every movement risked exposure. Somewhere nearby, a vehicle engine growled, starting and stopping in irregular bursts. She froze. A spotlight cut through the canopy, swinging in arcs that made the trees cast monstrous shadows. The enemy had adjusted. Their patrols had learned. Her previously safe routes now carried traps she hadn't accounted for. One wrong step would put her directly in the path of rifles, and any miscalculation might expose the documents that could determine the outcome of an entire campaign. In the command room, analysts' eyes darted between screens as reports of her last known position conflicted with intercepted transmissions. A junior officer pointed at a flickering radar feed. "She's moving east," he said, voice tight. "But that path, there shouldn't be anyone there." The senior intelligence officer leaned over the map, frowning at the overlapping coordinates of German patrols and artillery positions. "No," he muttered. "They're not just searching for her. They're hurting her. Into something bigger." Panic didn't settle and it roared. Every order sent to forward units risked misalignment. Every misalignment could cost lives back in the field. She adjusted her course, crawling through a low ditch that cut between two warehouses. A sudden snap a twig, or a wire code. Her breath caught. Boots fell into rhythm behind her, distant but deliberate. She realized with a jolt, the enemy had anticipated her hesitation. They were shaping the hunt, anticipating her every move. The documents inside her satchel weighed more than the mud, more than her exhaustion. She reminded herself to breathe slowly, to stay calm, to think 2 steps ahead. Each second stretched into eternity. Suddenly an explosion ripped through a nearby building. Dust, debris, and a shockwave slammed into her, nearly toppling her into the mud. She rolled, head pressed against the cold earth as splinters scattered. The enemy was escalating now. Not searching, they were punishing. Reinforcements arrived from the northern perimeter, their boots thundering, radios crackling, dogs straining on leashes. Her heart raced as she realized the perimeter was closing in faster than any calculation could predict. Inside headquarters, the tension spiked. Officers scrambled to adjust maps and timelines in real time. One typed furiously, overlaying known patrol paths with enemy communications traffic, trying to anticipate the next move. "She's a live variable," the senior officer said. "Every step she takes alters the battlefield." The room was silent for a moment. Then a distant voice whispered, "But this isn't the real problem." It wasn't fear, it was understanding. The enemy was no longer reacting. They were executing a plan with her as the trigger. She pressed forward. Low and silent, slipping between crates and debris, aware of every snapping branch, every shuffle of boots, every whisper of movement. Her mind cataloged possibilities with surgical precision. A gun jammed somewhere in the compound, sending a soldier reeling. A radio shorted out, spewing static. Reinforcements arrived early, creating new danger zones. Each complication required instant adaptation. Her training, instincts, and nerves were tested to the absolute limit. Then, as if the night itself had conspired, a second enemy flare erupted directly above her. She flattened into the mud, eyes half shut against the searing white light. She could hear officers shouting, dogs barking, vehicles moving in precise alignment with the flare's rhythm. The enemy was orchestrated, their chaos controlled, their chaos deadly. She gritted her teeth, forcing her body to remain calm, forcing her brain to calculate, forcing herself to stay alive. Minutes stretched. Her wet gloves clutched the documents as she edged along a high wall, scraping silently, aware that one sound would betray her. Behind her, floodlights swept past, narrowly missing her shadow. She counted seconds between sweeps, calculated the speed of patrols, timed her movement perfectly, and in that instant, she became invisible, a ghost. But the silence was deceptive. From every direction, signals, footsteps, and engine roars suggested she was never alone. The enemy was shaping the battlefield around her presence. Inside Allied Command, an officer realized the impossibility of the situation. Enemy deployments were reacting faster than intelligence allowed. Something was coordinating the chaos, something that anticipated the operatives' every move. "They're not just inside," he said quietly. "They're predicting." Papers rustled, officers exchanged silent glances. Every contingency seemed inadequate. Every calculated maneuver was already anticipated. On the ground, she reached the far edge of the warehouse district. Mud slicked her boots, rain plastered her hair to her face, satchel pressed to her chest. She paused for a fraction of a second, just enough to hear the controlled precision of enemy movement behind her, to feel the weight of artillery vibrations beneath her, to smell the burning residue of an explosion she hadn't even noticed before. She adjusted her route, scanning ahead, eyes flicking to the patterns of shadow and light, calculating escape routes and alternate paths. She knew, instinctively, that the night was far from over. A sudden commotion, a door slammed open in the warehouse to her right. Metal scraping against concrete made her freeze again. Soldiers rushed out, rifles at the ready, their movements coordinated as though choreographed. She ducked into a small alcove, holding her breath, letting the chaos pass. A single dog barked, echoing through the night. The soldiers moved on, unaware of her exact location, but close enough to sense her presence. Every heartbeat felt like a hammer strike. Back in headquarters, one analyst whispered to another. They didn't know the enemy was already inside. The room went quiet. That one realization reframed every map, every intercept, every movement reported. The operative was not simply infiltrating, she was walking through an active operational theater, where the enemy's strategy was evolving in real time. Every step she took risked triggering something massive, something irreversible. She pushed onward, keeping her body low, sliding through mud, weaving between debris, always scanning. Rain and darkness combined to mask her movement. Every step forward required calculation, timing, and nerve. Her gloves tore slightly on splintered wood, and she ignored it. Pain was secondary. Survival and the fate of the mission was paramount. The night stretched, measured in micro-decisions, small victories, and near misses. She crossed a narrow path just as a patrol's flashlight swept past, the beam so close she could feel the warmth. She flattened herself against the ground, counting breaths, listening to boots, timing the sweep of vehicles. Another flare ignited far ahead, illuminating her exit route. She pressed forward again, sprinting between cover points with every ounce of energy she had. And in that precise moment after every calculation, every risk, every step, the first true sense of clarity hit her. She was no longer merely surviving. She was controlling her path through chaos, manipulating the battlefield itself. And every misstep the enemy made was a reflection of her influence. She wasn't simply reacting. She was orchestrating her own survival, while unknowingly steering the enemy's own hand. From the vantage of Allied Command, a senior officer watched the unfolding reports, eyes narrowing at the screen. "She's changing their pattern," he said quietly. "Every step she takes is bending the battlefield in ways we can't fully measure." The realization hung over the room like a storm cloud. The operative wasn't just in danger. She had become the pivot around which the night's events would turn. And just as the tension reached its apex, a distant sound split the night alow. Mechanical whir, unfamiliar and out of place. Engines? Aircraft? Something else entirely? The operative froze, every muscle coiled, every sense on alert. She knew instinctively that the moment to escape had arrived. But the threat she sensed was unlike any she had encountered before. Something bigger was coming. Something she had not anticipated. The storm of mud, rain, guns, engines, and flashes of light converged. And for the first time, the operative felt the full scale of the night's danger. Not just a hunt, but a battle, a test, a crucible designed around her. And as she prepared to move again, she realized the worst was yet to come. The night air was electric with tension, charged not by storm clouds, but by the impossible precision of unfolding chaos. Every footstep she took through the mud, every scrape against splintered wood, carried the weight of entire operations teetering on the edge of collapse. Her satchel was wet and heavy, the documents inside pressing against her chest like lead. She had memorized every inch of the compound, every patrol pattern, every blind spot, but tonight, nothing adhered to the rules she knew. Enemy units moved faster than any intelligence had predicted, shifting and repositioning as if anticipating her thoughts. As if the night itself were conspiring to trap her. She pressed forward, low and deliberate, muscles screaming, lungs burning, every breath measured and precise. Above, the clouds churned, obscuring the moonlight, turning shadows into jagged threats. A distant explosion ripped through a storage building, sending firelight flickering across mud and debris. She ducked into the shadow of a collapsed wall, listening to boots pounding close by, to the hiss of radios, to the clink of weapons adjusting for range. Each sound was a potential death sentence, each vibration underfoot, a warning of pursuit. Her mind raced, calculating angles, timing the sweep of lights, planning movements in half-second intervals. She could not falter. Failure was unthinkable. Every second was a choice between life and death. Inside Allied command, officers were forced to revise every projection in real time. Radar feeds, decoded transmissions, and intercepted signals were now in conflict with every known pattern of enemy behavior. A map overlay flashed red as a senior intelligence officer traced movement patterns across sectors that should have been empty. "They've accelerated deployment," he said grimly. "Every contingency we planned is compromised." Officers whispered over each other, issuing emergency reroutes, canceling movements, calling for extraction support that may or may not arrive in time. The tension was nearly palpable, pressing down on them like a storm of sound and pressure. Back in the field, she ran across an open area, calculating every flash of light, every twitch of movement, every echo in the night. A single misstep could expose her position to 100 eyes. Tracer rounds streaked the sky above the tree line, and she felt the wind of bullets brushing past her. She rolled into a shallow ditch, mud splattering across her face, and forced herself to stay silent. Her breathing slowed, her heart pounding in controlled rhythm. For the first time, she realized she was no longer merely avoiding capture, she was navigating a collapsing battlefield, where every move could trigger a cascade of destruction. Suddenly, a vehicle blocked her planned route. She crouched behind a stack of crates, calculating alternatives. The engine idled, but she could hear rifles being loaded inside, the metallic click echoing in the night. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the sharp ache in her hands from the cold, the mud, and the strain of the satchel. Improvisation became survival. With a deep, measured breath, she flanked the vehicle, hugging the shadows. Sliding through the mud with the grace of desperation, her senses expanded, absorbing every flicker of movement, every reflected light, every distant shout. Every second counted twice. Every mistake was amplified by the enemy's uncanny response. Meanwhile, in the command room, a junior officer noticed something alarming on the map overlay. Enemy units were converging on her location faster than estimated. "She's walking into a trap," he said under his breath. The senior officer barely looked up, his eyes locked on the tracking data. "Then she'll have to make it her own trap," he muttered. Orders flew back and forth, misaligned, redundant, contradictory. Communications were jammed at the edges of the sector. Intelligence was fragmented, and panic simmered just below the surface. Outside, the night storm mirrored the chaos inside lightning, illuminating the tangle of units, artillery, and patrols, as if the sky itself were echoing the danger. She pressed forward again, forced to navigate between open fields of fire and shadowed cover. Mud pulled at her boots, rain slicked her gloves, and the satchel pressed painfully against her side. Each step required precision. A patrol turned a corner unexpectedly. She froze, flattened herself against the ground, holding her breath while the soldiers passed. Time stretched. When they moved on, she inched forward, calculating the sweep of the next searchlight. Timing the cadence of the boots she couldn't see. Every movement was a decision. Every decision carried monumental consequences. Then came the first unexpected betrayal. A minor ally had misreported coordinates, leaving her near the wrong extraction point. She realized the error instantly. The backup route she had memorized was now compromised, covered by enemy reinforcements arriving ahead of schedule. A gun jammed on a nearby soldier's rifle, briefly distracting him, giving her a precious moment to slide along the wall. She used it, rolling into cover, but the awareness of the compromised path added a new layer of stress. The mission had already escalated beyond her control. Survival demanded rapid improvisation and razor-sharp focus. Flares lit the night sky again, closer, brighter. Shadows shifted violently. She darted from one cover to another, every move calculated, every misstep potentially fatal. Rain and mud combined to create a sensory overload, the smell of wet earth, the flash of light, the sounds of engines, the clatter of weapons, the shouts of soldiers, the distant roar of artillery. Her mind became a machine of decision-making. She adjusted, adapted, advanced. She could no longer think in terms of safe paths, only in terms of probabilities, outcomes, survival ratios. Inside headquarters, Senior Officer noticed that her movements were affecting the enemy's operations more than anyone anticipated. "She's bending the battlefield," he said quietly. "Everything we see, every unit move, every deployment is a reaction to her choices." Analysts stared at maps, trying to predict her next move, but she had become an unpredictable factor, a force shaping events more than reacting to them. Panic, frustration, admiration, it all mixed in the room, unspoken but palpable. Then came the second betrayal. Her primary extraction signal had failed. Communication with the Allied liaison was severed. Her previous plan, every calculation made and hours of preparation, was now unreliable. She could no longer trust backup signals or patrol timings. Every decision now required intuition, improvisation, and risk beyond anything she had previously imagined. The night was collapsing, the battlefield folding, and she alone stood between the documents and the enemy. The rain intensified, stinging her face, washing mud into her eyes. She pressed on, muscles screaming, lungs burning. The enemy was closing in, faster, smarter, more coordinated than expected. A distant explosion rocked the ground, splintering debris around her. Another flare lit the night, revealing her shadow only briefly before darkness swallowed it. She rolled, sprinted, crawled, and leveraged every ounce of skill and instinct she possessed. The documents must survive. She must survive. Failure was not an option. And then she reached the edge of the compound, approaching the final obstacle, the heavily guarded exit. A narrow path flanked by patrols, vehicles, and a machine gun emplacement she had memorized, but which now was active and unpredictable. Her satchel throbbed against her chest, her body ached, and yet her mind was laser-focused. Every muscle, every nerve, every sense was tuned to the rhythm of the night, to the chaos surrounding her. She knew that the next 60 seconds could decide not only her life, but the survival of entire units waiting for the intelligence she carried. A deep breath, a calculated movement. She lunged forward, low to the ground, timing the sweep of the searchlights perfectly. Tracer rounds zipped overhead. Patrols shouted, and for an instant, the world became a blur of sound, light, and motion. Then she slipped past the first checkpoint, then the second. Adrenaline surged. Every step was precise. Every heartbeat was a countdown. And in that moment, she became the pivot, the turning point around which the night's events would hinge. A senior officer at headquarters leaned back, exhaling slowly. And then, he whispered, almost to himself, in a moment no historian could explain. The room waited, breath held, fingers hovering over radios and maps. Outside, the operative disappeared into darkness, but the night was far from over. The escalation had reached its peak, the climax approaching. And everything about the mission was about to change in ways no one could predict. The night had become a war unto itself. Mud, Rain, gunfire, and the hum of engines merged into a symphony of chaos, each note threatening to crush her under its weight. The operative pressed forward, chest heaving, satchel heavy against her side, every sense sharpened to an almost painful intensity. The enemy's movements were relentless, yet she had begun to anticipate them. Reading patterns in shadow and light, timing footsteps and rotations with preternatural precision, every step forward was an act of defiance against the chaos that sought to consume her. Ahead, the final obstacle loomed. The heavily guarded exit route she had memorized weeks ago. The narrow path was flanked by 2 patrols, a machine gun nest, and a vehicle stationed as a checkpoint. She pressed against the mud-slicked wall, assessing angles, calculating timing. The rain blurred her vision, dripping into her eyes, yet she adjusted instinctively. One miscalculation would be fatal. She inhaled deeply, forcing her mind into razor-sharp focus. She wasn't just running. She was navigating a living battlefield, bending enemy reactions to her advantage without them realizing it. Suddenly, a gunshot cracked, the sharp report echoing across the trees. Bullets ricocheted, kicking up mud. Her first move, a calculated roll, saved her from exposure. She scrambled forward, pressed to the wall, timing her advance between the sweep of searchlights. Every step, every breath, every heartbeat was measured, yet the fear was constant, gnawing at her spine. Behind her, enemy boots moved in perfect synchronization, her presence the invisible thread pulling them forward. She realized this mission was no longer merely about intelligence. It was survival against impossible odds. Inside headquarters, tension had escalated to near hysteria. Officers were shouting over overlapping communications, orders conflicting, intel fragmented. A senior analyst stared at a map overlay, realizing the enemy had anticipated her every move for over 30 minutes. "She's controlling the battlefield," he whispered. The room went silent for a beat, each person processing what they had just realized. Her movements had reshaped the operation. She had become the pivot point, the unexpected variable, bending the flow of conflict in real time. A flare erupted overhead, illuminating the narrow exit path for a brief, searing instant. She froze, body pressed into the mud, eyes scanning the patrols. The machine gun nest fired once, then paused. The timing was perfect. She lunged, rolling low, the mud soaking her clothes, her gloves slick. The enemy fired blindly in response. Tracer rounds cut the air above, splintering the night into streaks of light. Her heart hammered. She counted each second, each beat, each movement. Survival was no longer probability. It was instinct, trained, honed, sharpened against terror and necessity. In the compound, a minor ally had provided a false path as a distraction, drawing a small group of guards away. She slipped through, moving low, almost crawling, aware that any noise could betray her. Rain mixed with sweat and mud on her face, stinging her eyes, yet she pressed forward. The satchel's weight was unbearable now, but she bore it, understanding its contents could alter the course of war. Every sense screamed, "Move, survive, deliver." Every second felt like an eternity stretched across a knife edge. A sudden alarm sounded from the perimeter, mechanical wail amplified by panic. Soldiers scrambled, weapons raised, radios crackling. Behind her, she heard the unmistakable snap of a gun jam, a curse, and a shuffle of boots. The enemy had been forced to adapt in real time, as she had been, and for a brief, perfect moment. The battlefield had become a chessboard she controlled. She moved with precision, weaving past patrols, timing the sweep of floodlights, sliding along walls, rolling through mud, each motion deliberate, each second calculated. Then came the final challenge, direct confrontation with a senior enemy patrol. Fully armed, alerted, and prepared. They had positioned themselves at a choke point, anticipating her path. She pressed herself low, listening to the pattern of their movement. A split-second decision: create a diversion or confront them head-on. Instinct won. She hurled a small object, creating a clatter behind the patrol. Reflexes honed by months of training took over as she sprinted through the diversion. Bullets whizzing past, mud spraying in every direction. She slid under a fallen beam, rolled onto her feet, and ran, the narrow path stretching ahead like a corridor of fate. In headquarters, analysts held their breath as the maps flickered with each movement she made. She's going to make it, someone whispered. But even as relief touched the room, tension remained palpable. The night was still alive with danger, every movement carrying potential catastrophe. The clock on the operations timeline ticked down, each second bringing her closer to extraction or annihilation. She approached the final checkpoint. Rain poured over her, washing mud and sweat into her eyes. The enemy machine gun nests scanned systematically. Patrols flanked the path. And then, with almost supernatural timing, distraction she had orchestrated moments earlier bore fruit. A small explosion in a distant sector drew the attention of the nearest patrols. She seized the opportunity, sprinting across the exposed ground, chest pounding, boots slipping in the mud. Tracer rounds hissed past her, cutting the night into streaks of death. She dove for the wall on the far side, rolling into cover, heart hammering, lungs burning. The extraction point was inside a small clearing at the edge of the compound. Just enough space for a waiting vehicle. She counted her steps, measured her timing, gauged the enemy's reaction. The vehicle's engine roared, its lights flickering across mud and foliage. A final surge of adrenaline carried her across the last 10 meters. She slammed into the mud near the vehicle, scrambled aboard, and collapsed inside. The satchel pressed against her chest. The driver hit the accelerator, and the vehicle lurched forward, tires spinning in mud, racing away from the chaos. For the first time in hours, she exhaled fully. The night had been navigated, the enemy had been outmaneuvered, and the documents were still safe. But the night was not yet over. In her mind, she replayed every step, every sound, every calculation. Each micro-decision had determined the survival of not only herself, but countless others, waiting for the intelligence she carried. Every breath felt borrowed, every heartbeat earned at headquarters. A senior officer finally spoke, voice low, awestruck. And then, in a moment no historian could explain, everything changed. Maps blinked with red dots that had moved in impossible patterns. Communications logs showed reactions faster than theory allowed. Analysts stared at the screens, realizing that her presence had shifted the balance of forces in ways no one had anticipated. Her survival, her decisions, her precision, everything had altered the course of events. Outside, the rain began to lighten. Mud clung to her clothes. Sweat stung her eyes. Her chest heaved, muscles burned, nerves trembled. And yet she understood instinctively that this night, the mission, the chaos, the near-death moments was not yet complete. What she had survived, what she had accomplished, would ripple far beyond her understanding. The war itself, in a small but crucial corner of Europe, had been changed forever. She slumped against the side of the vehicle, finally allowing herself a moment of stillness. Her hands still clutched the satchel. Her mind replayed the night's horrors and near misses. Outside, the forest loomed, dark and silent once more, but with an underlying tension that promised more danger, more challenges, more truths yet to be revealed. And as the vehicle carried her toward safety, she knew the climax had ended, but the story, the consequences, and the hidden truths were only beginning to unfold. Dawn broke with reluctant light. The first fragile rays filtering through the storm-clouded sky, casting a muted glow over the battlefield. Mud and debris coated every surface, and the air still carried the acrid temps of gunpowder and wet earth. Silence had returned, though it was fragile, pregnant with the memory of chaos. The echo of explosions and the distant groan of engines retreating from the scene. She stepped from the extraction vehicle, boots sinking into the mud, satchel clutched tightly against her chest. Her muscles ached. Her clothes were soaked, and her mind replayed the night's horrors with relentless clarity. Yet in that exhaustion, there was a quiet triumph. She had survived, and the documents, the intelligence that could shift the war's tide, were intact. The Allied command received the first comprehensive reports. Analysts pored over the data, enemy movements that had seemed impossible, patrol patterns that defied logic. flares and radar signals that had been precisely timed against the operative's location. One officer muttered in disbelief, "She changed the battlefield. Every response we saw was because of her." The realization struck the room with a mixture of awe and unease. They had known her skill, but the night's events exceeded even their most calculated expectations. The human element, the intuition, the courage, the precision had turned a near impossible mission into an unrecorded victory. Yet the aftermath was not merely operational. It was profoundly human. Survivors emerged, muddy and exhausted. Recounting the terror of the night, a patrol trapped by miscommunication, a small squad forced to abandon its post, a vehicle narrowly escaping ambush. Voices trembled as they described what they had witnessed, the near misses. The chaos, the operative moving like a ghost through enemy lines. Letters and diaries hastily written before sleep could claim them, captured the intimate, raw emotions of those who had survived. One note read simply, "She was everywhere and nowhere. I don't know how she did it, but I know we would have been lost without her." Hidden truths soon surfaced. In the aftermath, a partially destroyed enemy communications post yielded files previously classified, revealing that the enemy had known of a female operative in the area. Her mission had not been anticipated by Allied intelligence, yet somehow the enemy had prepared contingencies against her presence. Her careful planning and improvisation had allowed her to turn their own preparations into weaknesses. A senior officer scanned the decrypted files, shaking his head. "Everything we thought we knew, it was only part of the picture. She was more than a soldier. She became a force multiplier we never anticipated. Yet, for all the clarity of victory, mysteries remained." Eyewitness accounts from behind enemy lines described fleeting shadows, a figure moving faster than possible, vanishing, reappearing, always precise, always unpredictable. Reports hinted at sounds no one could verify, a whisper of movement in empty corridors, the flash of a figure that could not be caught on any camera. She had been there, yet invisible. A living enigma whose actions had saved lives, shifted the battlefield, and left the enemy scrambling in confusion. The operative herself moved quietly through the aftermath, delivering the documents to a secure command post. Her hands still trembled slightly from adrenaline, her body exhausted, yet her mind was already reviewing the night, analyzing every decision, every near-death encounter. Command debriefs followed, voices asking questions about timing, strategy, improvisation. She answered with precision, recounting details that seemed almost superhuman, calculated movement, anticipation of enemy behavior, manipulation of chaos itself. For those listening, it was awe-inspiring, bordering on disbelief. And yet, the most startling revelation was yet to come. Hidden among the documents was a fragment of enemy intelligence she had not expected to find, a partially encoded directive, referencing not merely military objectives but secret experiments, locations and plans that remained classified for decades. Its discovery suggested that the night's events had prevented a catastrophe, far greater than the loss of territory or personnel. The implications were staggering. She had not only survived, she had protected secrets that could have changed the trajectory of the war itself. Letters from soldiers reached her later, recounting their experiences, their gratitude, and their shock. One stated, "You were a ghost, a shadow, a force we could only imagine. The enemy feared you in ways they could not name, and we are alive because of it." Diaries from officers reflected on the moral weight of the mission, the near-impossible decisions she had made, and the courage required to succeed against overwhelming odds. Even months later, the memory of that night haunted those who had witnessed it, and then came the final twist, a revelation that no one could have predicted. Archives sealed for decades contained eyewitness reports describing a figure in the enemy compound that night, carrying no weapons, yet commanding attention and obedience from those around her. Surveillance logs hinted at a presence that moved faster than human reaction should allow, appearing and disappearing at will. The operative had not only survived, she had altered the enemy's perception of reality. Becoming a legend even among those who never saw her, the Allied command issued statements, reports, and commendations. Yet the full truth of what had transpired remained classified. Files were redacted, names omitted, movements obscured. For decades, only fragments of her night's actions were known. But for those who had been there, and for those who would later study the declassified portions, one truth stood clear. The night she entered enemy territory alone, her courage, skill, and improvisation had changed the course of history in ways no one could fully explain. And as she walked away from the compound, finally allowed to rest, a final thought lingered as shadow in her mind. What she had seen that night, the secrets uncovered, the patterns manipulated. The enemy movements anticipated would remain locked in archives, classified beyond ordinary comprehension. The truth of her presence, her decisions, and the full consequences of her actions would remain a mystery for generations. For the viewer, the lingering question remains, whispered in the silence of the aftermath. What did she truly witness? What did she truly accomplish beyond what history records? And what truths remain hidden, buried in the files still locked away, waiting for a world ready or unready to understand them? The camera pulls back, showing the storm-scarred compound, the rain-streaked mud and the faint silhouette of a woman disappearing into dawn's fragile light. The war continues, but the legend of that night, her night remains, and the truth about what she saw, what she changed, and what she carried remains locked in archives, waiting to be discovered.